Daryl Recommends Podcast is a podcast recommending series and shouldn't be mistaken as a reviewing one. Opinions about each show are my own and should not reflect what each podcast has to offer. Content warnings aside, I believe if any recommendation in my series interests you, you should give it a chance, regardless of how I personally feel about the show.
Marco. Polo. Marco. Polo. Marco. I have spent my life in the shadow of this great and winding river. I have always dwelt in the shadow of my God. Marco! Polo! My Nana Glass, who knew the straits and sacred tides of the lower delta better than any fisherman I ever met, would tell me that there were people who'd been born to the land, and there were people who'd been born to the water. And the people born to the land...
Two followers of a forbidden river god go upstream in search of revelations. With other gods, worshippers, and the police on their tails, our followers' journey will lead them to something that's both horrible and holy. The Silt is a horror fantasy podcast about faith, identity, and sacrifice. Created by John Ware and Minna Hussain, The Silt currently has 2 seasons with a third and final one on the way. This show follows a cast of characters from various walks of life, brought together under their unique circumstances as they learn more about themselves and the people they want to become. This show is really good, and I don't know if I just don't follow enough people who are really into it, but I wish I see more of the show being talked about in like the podcast spaces that I frequent, because everything about this show is absolutely amazing. The writing is fantastic, the cast is fantastic, the horror is just everything I love about like folk horror, religious horror, like, it does it so good. One of the things, like, my one like specific thing that I don't see often done in horror is I love characters who interpret something horrible as like this like holy thing to be worshipped, even if this thing is incredibly evil. Not necessarily worship as just a malicious way of like, I want the destroyer of worlds to destroy the planet. More so of just like kind of like how Midnight Mass does it. I think Midnight Mass is probably one of the most well-known shows that does it just the way I like it. And the Silt is another one. And, oh god, it's so fantastic. The horror in the show is great. There's a lot of body horror in it. It gets bloody. Sometimes it gets gory, but not as often as some other horror shows that I've recommended in the past. Which is fine, because you could do really great horror with 0 blood. And this show does horror so good. I love how it does it. I love the way that they mix like just faith with just this like horrible setting. And what's so funny is like a lot of the horror that's in this show is just normal in this universe. I think the Siltverse probably has done the best version of a fantasy world based off a modern day, like current day setting I have ever seen in like a majority of media. If not, probably my absolute favorite version of it, because you have recognizable stuff, like they got cars, they have radio, they have internet. The world is kind of dystopian. They're like post like a big gigantic war they had at the start of the podcast, but it's still very reminiscent of like our modern world, but they don't have like, for example, like the US or Europe or whatever. They got their own countries. And just like, oh yeah, they turned Larry into a shrimp the other day to, I don't know, make the river not so dirty anymore, and it worked somehow. Let's just sacrifice Jerry to the shrimp god. Because, this podcast has a thing with shrimple, which are shrimp people. I made that definition up. Literally when I started listening to this show. Maybe it's just because I've been living in Maryland for so long, but just the fact that this show has such a focus on like crustaceans and stuff is really funny to me, because everybody on the east side of Maryland is obsessed with crabs. So that's just been like a little bit of like personal hilarity to me, especially since I'm not from Maryland, so And I could gush about these characters all day. Just the characters in this show are so good. And it's like, I don't think I ever like have a character show up, and I genuinely hate seeing them show up. Even for characters who like, I personally like, I wouldn't say they're my favorite. My like definition of characters who aren't my favorite versus characters who I think are badly written is like completely different. All the characters in here, even the ones I don't like, I love seeing them on screen because they're horrible in some way or another, but it's so fun to watch them do stuff. Just all the characters in the show are fantastic, and I love the writing, I love the development. Ah, my goodness, I could just gush about Paige all day. I love Paige and Carpenter, and just the two of them are my favorites, and I just love what this show does with like writing for those characters. And I could just like, I could go so on and on about like character development tidbits. The end of season 2 hurt me, which is really funny because it came out on my birthday. So, the season 2 finale, I mean. So that was a happy birthday present for me that kind of hurt my heart a little bit. But it's fine! It's why I listen to this podcast, because it likes to hurt me in fun, immeasurable ways. And it's just, oh, it's so good. I just love it a lot. One of the things I also really like about the show is the way it presents queer characters. I like how casually it drops them versus like in a lot of like other like media that brings queer characters in it. Like this, so bringing it back to like when I was talking about this being a best version of a modern inspired fantasy world, is the fact that it consistently feels like a fantasy world despite having a ton of recognizable stuff to like our real life modern day. And I think one of the things that I like about it, especially for a show where the idea, like the main like concept with it is about faith and how like there's a God for everything, and you could pray to this God to have little miracles happen, and sometimes they want horrible things and sometimes they cause horrible things, but we still do it. And just that little bit of anti-capitalism messaging just sprinkled in there so nicely. But the way they present queer characters in the show so casually without making it the thing, I think is really nice, especially for like, you say this is a show where like all the characters are like really religious. Like, I don't know if it's just me as a queer person. I would think like, oh God, like what did they do to the gay character? Treat them the same as everybody else. And sometimes it's horrible, but it's not because they're gay. And it's the horror podcast thing where horrible things happen to people all the time, and we sit and we love it so much. And I just like how it does it, especially when it introduces its trans characters, because I think it's kind of like the best way to do it in especially in a story where you really don't need to like go around and like explain why a character uses they them pronouns. Like, they have a whole season where one of the main characters uses they, them pronouns, and they never make it a thing. And they're very casual, like, about the fact that the character is not male or female. And, like, one of the main characters is transgender, and how they casually drop the fact that they're transgender without making it the thing. And I think that's done really good. Especially since, like, it's not... Like, they do have characters who kind of reflect a little bit on their queer identity, but it's not a source of like, oh yeah, here's all this drama, and part of it is because of your queer identity, and it's relevant to the story just because. And like, it's like, yeah, I like that a lot. It's one of the things I like about the Magnus Archives too. I love it when podcasts just do that, especially like, if you don't need it. We don't always need queer angst in our fictional media. And I like it when it's not shoehorned in a story that doesn't really need it. Not to say that I don't think there's some stories that do need it, because, people sometimes when people are writing stuff, certain stuff has to be, as somebody who's writing their own queer horror story, I understand when you have to bring up the topic of like homophobia and stuff like that. But like I feel like what this does nice is they make a fantasy setting and they go, okay, yeah, but homophobia isn't a thing that happens, I guess. Which is nice. It's very nice. That's basically what I'm getting at. It's just nice to have a story with queer characters, and we don't need to think about the fact that they could be in a setting where they could get hate crimed. That's a nice thing. I'm going to jump into just mentioning quickly, because I mentioned earlier about the body horror, the gore. It's a kind of like dystopian capitalistic hellscape story. So if you kind of don't like that kind of setting, or, you know, the subject, at this point, if I recommend a horror podcast, like, one of the first things I'm going to mention is just, like, is it very gory? This one, not so much as some of the other ones I've recommended in the past, like Malevolent and Mayfair Watcher Society. It does get pretty bad in some episodes, but the thing that you have to watch out for in this show is probably just the body horror. If you're somebody who doesn't like weird body horror, like, you know, people turning into crab people, or Shrimple. Shrimple, my beloved. I need to see more Shrimple. Other than that, like, the cast for this show is just so fucking good too. Like, I keep going back to, like, oh yeah, the cast is fantastic, but like Maeve DeBoon, Binar, Lucille Valentine, and Jimmy Yamaguchi, I owe you guys my life, because holy crap, your guys' voice acting is great, and I doubt they're ever going to listen to this, but if you do, I love it, so I'm going to say it again, even if it's 20 years from now, and you're like, oh, I remember this little project, and I'm like, hey, I love your guys' work! Hi! Sorry. But yeah, no, I just like, the voice acting in this show is just phenomenal, and that's just like the main cast of like most reoccurring characters. Like, I go on to about everybody else. They get a lot of familiar voices if you're fans of the Magnus Archives, Malevolent, Hello from the Hollowoods, Wooden Overcoats, and other shows. And just, like, there's a lot of new voices in here that I've never heard of before who are just, like, really good. Like, this actually was the podcast that introduced me to Binar and Maeve DeBrun as voice actors, and also Lucille Valentine and Jimmy Yamaguchi. But I also follow other podcasts that I know Binar and Maeve DeBrun are in, and I do listen to a couple of other ones, like the Mayfair Watcher Society that Binar's in. And so I think, like, this was a really good show to get introduced to them at, because holy crap, you guys are just such great voice actors, all of you, everybody in the show. If you're in this show, you are amazing, okay? Everybody in this show is amazing, and I'm really glad I listened to it. It introduced me to a bunch of great voice actors. John and Muna are just incredible with their podcasting work. I need to listen to I Am in Askew. That's on my list. I'm actually going to be listening to quite a long podcast that I will be recommending when I catch up to it. But that's because my to record videos for list is getting a bit long, and I think something really long to fill in the space, so I have time to get a couple more videos out. Not that I'm like super rushed to get a ton of videos out, but you know, I don't want to oversaturate myself with a bunch of podcasts and I'd be like, oh, but I just listened to this, so I have to recommend it now. So yeah. Anyway, if you've listened to this far in the video, thank you for listening. Please go check out the Silt Verses if you've never listened to it. Go check out their Patreon. Go check out all the other voice actors in it, because you guys hurt my heart in all the good ways. And also, just, yeah, that's pretty much it. Go listen to the show. And if you're interested in me, Daryl, and I haven't annoyed you guys yet, then maybe you want to check out my social medias. I make comics and animation sometimes. And I also go and occasionally write things that usually end up becoming comics. And yeah, it's pretty much that. Okay, goodbye.